I never meant for it to happen. But I let it happen. I betrayed the man I married. The vows I made. And for what? A fleeting moment of feeling seen? I let loneliness twist into desire. And desire into destruction. I crossed a line I can't uncross. With someone who should have never been more than family. Now, I walk through this house with guilt sewn into my skin. Disgusted with what I became. I traded trust for touch. Love for lust. And now I can't look in the mirror without seeing a liar. I ruined everything. For a moment I mistook for meaning. And I hate myself for it. The story begins in a quiet, upscale neighborhood just outside Chicago, where the air always seemed too still. The kind of silence that whispered of something missing. My husband's long business trips had become the norm, leaving behind a house that echoed with absence. At first, I filled the void with chores, errands, and late-night television, but over time, the silence started to settle into my bones. We barely spoke anymore, and when we did, it felt scripted, like two actors reciting lines in a play neither of us believed in. I didn't recognize myself in the mirror most days. My reflection looked polished, composed, but inside, I was crumbling. Love had been replaced with logistics. What time's your flight? Did you pay the utility bill? The worst part wasn't the loneliness, it was how used to it I had become. I couldn't remember the last time someone truly looked at me and saw a woman. Not just a wife managing the calendar. The quiet became unbearable, not because it was loud, but because it made me feel invisible. And that's when everything started to shift. I didn't know it then. But this stillness was just the calm before a storm that would change everything. It was during one of those long, endless weeks, when Charles had flown off to San Diego for yet another corporate conference, that Cole arrived. My stepson, now 23, was back from grad school, staying with us temporarily while job hunting in the city. I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years. And when he walked through the door that morning, suitcase in hand, I was caught off guard. The awkward teenager I remembered had grown into a tall, confident man, his voice deeper, his eyes more knowing. He smiled warmly when he saw me. "Hey," he said simply. And for a moment, it felt like someone had cracked open a window in that stuffy house. Over the next few days, something in the air shifted. He was kind, helpful, always offering to cook dinner or carry groceries. But it was more than that. It was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, curious. Thoughtful, as if he were seeing past the layers I kept hidden. And then there was the way my body reacted. A stirring I hadn't felt in years. It frightened me. One evening, after I'd showered and slipped into a thin cotton robe, I wandered into the kitchen to pour a glass of wine. I hadn't heard Cole come in from the garage. He appeared in the doorway. And for a heartbeat, everything stilled. His eyes flickered, not just surprise, but something else, something electric. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice low. "You didn't," I lied, though my breath had caught. "Just didn't expect anyone." He stepped forward, just enough to close the distance. And for a long moment, neither of us moved. The robe clung to me, damp from the shower, and I saw his eyes flick briefly down, then back up, but he didn't look away. Neither did I. There was heat there, not just in the room, but between us. "I forgot how quiet it gets around here," he said, his voice softer now. "It's kind of lonely." I nodded, unsure what to say. The weight of that word, lonely, hung heavy between us. I felt it deep in my chest. Because it was true. And the way he said it, it felt like an echo of everything I'd been trying to silence for years. "I'm going to head up," I murmured, brushing past him to move toward the hallway. But as I did, my hand grazed his, just a whisper of contact, and it sent a jolt through me. My breath hitched. I didn't stop walking, but I felt his gaze trail behind me like a second skin. That night, I lay awake for hours, replaying the moment again and again. It was nothing, but it was everything. And for the first time in years, I wasn't haunted by silence. I was haunted by possibility. The next morning, I tried to dismiss it, the way our fingers had brushed. The look in his eyes, the tingling warmth that lingered far longer than it should have. But it clung to me like perfume on skin. I wore it all day, even as I folded laundry, even as I made coffee, even as I reminded myself, over and over, "He's your stepson." But the heart doesn't always care for definitions. By late afternoon, a summer storm had rolled in. Rain lashed against the windows as thunder rumbled low in the distance. I was in the living room, curled up with a book I couldn't concentrate on, when I heard footsteps descending the stairs. Cole appeared in the doorway again, this time barefoot, in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt. His hair was still damp from a shower, and something about the casualness of him, so familiar, yet so grown, made my stomach flutter. "Storm's wild," he said, walking toward the window. "Kind of beautiful, though." I watched him from the couch, unable to stop myself. "It is," I replied quietly. "It makes the house feel even quieter, doesn't it?" He turned, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. "Sometimes I think silence is worse than noise," he said. "At least with noise, you know something's alive." His words landed deep. I looked away, suddenly self-conscious under the weight of his gaze. "You okay?" he asked gently, stepping closer. I hesitated. Lying felt too exhausting, too pointless. "I don't know," I admitted. "Some days I feel like I'm fading. Like I'm here, but not really seen." Cole didn't say anything right away. Then he moved to sit beside me, not too close. "Not yet. I see you," he said, his voice low but steady. "I've seen you from the moment I got here. And I think you've forgotten how much there is to see." His words hit like lightning, quiet but electrifying. I blinked, heart pounding, caught somewhere between wanting to cry and wanting to disappear. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. "You used to laugh a lot," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "I remember that from when I was younger. You haven't laughed once since I got back." A tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. Without a word, he reached out and gently wiped it away with his thumb. His hand lingered on my face, warm, grounding, and I didn't pull away. "I shouldn't be here like this," I whispered, but I didn't move. "I know," he said, "but I don't want to walk away if you're standing there looking like you've been waiting for someone to stay." The air between us pulsed, full of heat, confusion, longing. It wasn't a kiss. It was the space before a kiss, the breathless moment where nothing happens and everything changes. And I sat there, trembling, knowing that if I closed the gap, my life would never be the same again. I didn't move, neither did he. We sat there in a silence that wasn't empty, it was charged. Trembling at the edges, every second that passed felt like it stretched across lifetimes. I could feel his breath, close enough to sense but not close enough to touch. My heart thudded in my chest like a warning. But there was something stronger than fear stirring inside me, desire. Yes, but also hunger, not for sex, for connection, for meaning, for something that would pull me out of the numbness that had become my life. "I don't want to make things harder for you," Cole said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not," I replied, too quickly. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt my breath catch. His eyes weren't filled with lust. They held something else, confusion, tenderness, restraint. He was holding back. "For me, I think about you," I said before I could stop myself. "More than I should." He didn't speak, but his body leaned ever so slightly closer. Just enough for me to feel the heat radiating off him. "You're lonely," he said gently, "but so am I." I turned my head away, ashamed of the tears that suddenly blurred my vision. "This can't happen. It's wrong." "I know it is." "Is it?" he asked. "We're not blood. I'm not a kid. And you," he stopped himself. Then added, "You deserve more than what you've been given." His words were both balm and blade. I wanted to believe them. Needed to. But there were lines that had held my life together for years: marriage, loyalty, morality. Stepping over them now felt like letting go of everything I once believed made me good. "I don't want to be the reason your life gets more complicated," he added, softer now, "but I can't keep pretending there's nothing between us." I turned to face him again, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the storm outside. I studied the lines of his face, the strength in his jaw, the vulnerability hiding behind those confident eyes. He was right. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a crush. This was two souls finding each other in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and yet, somehow, feeling like it was the only time that had ever mattered. "I'm scared," I admitted. "I'm scared of what this means. What it might break." He reached out and took my hand. Then let's not decide anything tonight. He said gently. Let's just sit here. Let's just exist together. And so we did. No kisses. No promises. Just two people on a couch in a storm. Fingers intertwined. Breathing the same air. The world outside could fall apart, but in that moment, neither of us moved. Because moving meant answering questions we didn't know how to ask. But the truth was already there. Unspoken between us. Something had changed. And nothing would ever be the same again. That night, I couldn't sleep. Even after Cole had quietly retreated to his room, his hand slipping reluctantly from mine. His eyes holding mine for a moment longer than they should have. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Listening to the storm fade into silence. The house was still again. But this stillness was different. It buzzed with energy, like something waiting to happen. I could still feel the warmth of his hand in mine. Still hear his voice echoing in my ears. I got up around midnight. Restless. Needing something, anything, to quiet my mind. I padded downstairs barefoot, wearing only a long shirt and a robe loosely tied at the waist. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the dull glow from the stovetop clock. I poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter, letting the coolness of the tile calm my nerves. I didn't hear him come in. Couldn't sleep either? He asked. His voice low and rough with fatigue, or something else. I turned. He stood in the doorway, shirtless, a pair of joggers slung low on his hips. My breath caught. The image was innocent, technically, but nothing about the way my body responded felt innocent at all. I just needed some air, I said, though there was none left in my lungs. He stepped closer, not hurried, not aggressive, just steady, deliberate. I could see hesitation flicker across his features, like he was testing the gravity between us again. I meant what I said earlier. He continued, we don't have to figure this out all at once. But I'm here, and I'm not pretending anymore. I opened my mouth, but the words tangled on my tongue. I didn't know how to respond, because deep down, I didn't want to say no. I just wanted to stop feeling alone. Why me? I asked instead, my voice cracking. You could have anyone, someone your own age. Someone uncomplicated. He stepped closer, now only inches away. Because you're not just anyone. He said simply, you're you. And I see you, really see you, even when you try to hide. The confession unraveled me. Before I could stop myself, I reached for him, whether out of need or instinct. I didn't know. My fingers brushed his chest, and his hand came up to cup my cheek. Warm and gentle. I trembled beneath his touch, every nerve on fire. He leaned in, slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. When our lips finally met, it was soft, almost reverent. No rush, no hunger, just something aching and delicate, like a question we were both afraid to ask out loud. But with that kiss, something inside me cracked open. And in that moment, I stopped thinking about right or wrong. I stopped thinking entirely, because for the first time in years, I wasn't numb, I was alive. We didn't speak as the kiss deepened. Words would have only complicated what was already too much to process. His hands moved to my waist, steady and slow, like he was afraid I'd disappear if he touched me too fast. My fingers threaded through his hair, guiding him closer, until the weight of his body pressed gently against mine. Every part of me burned, not from lust alone, but from the sheer, unfamiliar sensation of being wanted. Not needed, not tolerated, wanted. He kissed me like he'd been waiting years to, and I kissed him like I'd forgotten I was allowed to feel this way. I don't remember how we got from the kitchen to the couch. Only the feel of his skin beneath my hands, the breathy way he whispered my name, the desperate, careful way he undressed me, not with greed, but reverence, like I was something delicate, something sacred. The robe slipped from my shoulders, the shirt followed, and I stood before him not just bare, but exposed in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. There was no shame in his eyes, just awe. You're beautiful, he whispered. I wanted to cry, not because of what we were doing, but because I hadn't heard those words in so long. I wasn't sure I believed them anymore. He kissed the side of my neck, his hands tracing the curve of my spine, and in his arms. I wasn't a wife, I wasn't a stepmother, I wasn't a woman burdened by age or boundaries or titles. I was just me. For once, we made love in the quietest way possible, like if we were too loud, The world might come crashing in. Every sigh, every trembling breath, every touch spoke what our mouths couldn't. I see you. I need this too. Don't let go. When it was over, we didn't move. My head rested against his chest, his fingers drawing soft circles along my shoulder. The steady rhythm of his breathing grounded me. But the guilt was already creeping in, curling up at the edges of my heart like smoke. What had we just done? What did this mean? I should have felt regret, disgust, something solid and condemning, but all I felt was a terrifying, aching warmth. For the first time in years, I felt whole, not because of what had happened physically, but because someone had looked at me like I mattered. Like I was worth touching, holding, loving. The silence returned, but it was no longer cold. It wrapped around us like a blanket, fragile and warm. I don't know what happens now, I whispered. Cole's arms tightened around me. We don't have to figure it out tonight, he said. We just breathe and hold on. So I did. For as long as I could, I held on. To him, to the moment, to the part of myself I thought I'd lost. The morning light filtered in through the sheer curtains, soft and golden, far too gentle for the storm that raged inside me. Cole was gone. The spot beside me on the couch was empty, but still warm. A folded blanket lay where he'd been, and my robe had been carefully draped across the armrest. He hadn't left in a rush. He'd left quietly, thoughtfully, but still, he had left. I sat up slowly, pulling the robe around me like armor. The moment I stood, the weight of it all came crashing down. Guilt twisted in my stomach like a knife. It was no longer just the delicious thrill of connection and release, it was something heavier now. The silence in the house felt sharp, not soothing. What had I done? I looked at the clock. It was barely 7 a.m. I could hear the distant hum of the shower upstairs, probably Cole. That meant he hadn't left the house. A strange relief settled over me, quickly followed by dread. What would I say to him? What could I possibly say that would make any of this feel okay? I wandered into the kitchen, every step echoing with questions I wasn't ready to answer. And then, the front door creaked open. My breath caught in my throat as Charles walked in, suitcase in one hand, phone in the other, already mid-conversation. Yeah, I landed early, figured I'd surprise her, he said cheerfully, dropping his bag with a loud thud. Flight was smooth. I'll call you later, okay? He hung up and turned toward me, smiling. Hey, babe. The sound of his voice hit me like a slap. Familiar, routine, unknowing. I swallowed the panic rising in my throat. You're home early, I managed. He stepped forward, pecked my cheek, completely unaware of the secret that still lingered in the very air around us. My skin recoiled beneath his touch. Not from hatred, but from the suffocating reminder that I was two different people now. The woman he kissed on the cheek, and the woman who, just hours ago, had given herself to someone else entirely. Someone who had seen her. Someone who had wanted her. I busied myself with coffee, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I saw Cole's car out front. Charles added, rubbing the back of his neck. Glad he's settling in. Yeah, I said quietly. He's been helpful. The guilt was unbearable. Every word out of my mouth felt like a lie. But what was worse was how easily I said them. How automatic it had become to hide. That day dragged on like molasses. Every glance at Cole a sharp reminder of what we'd done. We barely spoke. Every shared space became a minefield of unsaid things. We moved around each other like strangers carrying a secret they couldn't afford to drop. And that night, lying beside my husband while he snored softly in his sleep, I stared at the ceiling again. Only this time, I didn't feel restless. I felt trapped. And I couldn't stop thinking about Cole, or how wrong it all felt. Or how right it had. At least, for a little while. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope over fire. Charles remained oblivious, immersed in meetings, phone calls, and dinner plans with colleagues I'd long stopped trying to impress. He was home, technically, but never present. His kisses were routine, his questions shallow, and every time he touched me, my skin screamed with guilt. But the hardest part wasn't pretending for him. It was pretending around Cole. We had barely spoken since that night, when our eyes did meet across the kitchen table or in passing through the hallway. There was a flicker, recognition, longing, regret, but we didn't speak it. We couldn't. and in that silence, something between us began to ache. One evening, a week after Charles had returned, I found myself outside on the patio. The air was cool, and I wrapped a light sweater around my shoulders as I stared at the stars, hoping they might offer clarity, but all I found was the dull ache of wanting something I could no longer reach. I heard the sliding glass door open behind me, footsteps, then the soft creak of the patio chair beside mine. "Cole, I thought you were asleep," I said, barely above a whisper. "I couldn't," he replied, his voice strained. "I haven't been sleeping well." I nodded, unsure how to respond. The silence stretched again, heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, he spoke. "We should talk." I closed my eyes. "I know." He turned toward me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I don't regret what happened," he said, "but I regret how it's affecting you. I never wanted to hurt you." "You didn't," I said quickly. "You haven't." That night, it woke something up in me. "Cole, something I didn't know I'd lost." His jaw tensed. "But now you're hurting. I can see it, and that kills me." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt the ache in my chest pulse with something raw. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "Every part of me wants to go back to that night and stay there. But I can't stop hearing my husband's voice in the next room." "I'm not asking you to leave him," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I needed you to know I still think about it. About you. Every day." I swallowed hard. "Me too." The words fell like stones between us, heavy with truth. "I miss you," he added, softer now, "even when you're right in front of me." A tear slid down my cheek, and I didn't bother to wipe it away. "I miss me, too." And in that moment, I realized the cost of what we'd done wasn't just guilt or secrecy, it was the unbearable loss of something we could never fully have. Something that felt like love, but existed in the wrong place, at the wrong time. And still, I wasn't ready to let go. We both knew something had to give. Our hearts had been sprinting in opposite directions, one chasing freedom, the other clinging to caution, and now we stood still, breathless, waiting for someone to say what neither of us wanted to hear. The next morning, I stayed in bed longer than usual. I listened to the subtle rhythms of the house, the clinking of dishes downstairs, Charles rustling through his closet, the distant hum of Cole's car pulling out of the driveway. Everything sounded normal, but I wasn't. I walked through the day like I was underwater. Everything felt slowed, muted, as if my body hadn't caught up to my choices. Cole and I had said nothing definitive the night before, but there was a finality in our silence that neither of us dared to disturb. By mid-afternoon, I found myself wandering into the guest room, his room, while he was gone. It smelled like him. Clean soap, coffee, warm cotton. The bed was made, the desk neatly organized, but it was the folded note on the nightstand that stopped me cold. My name was written in his handwriting. Just, Rebecca. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. "I'm not leaving because I want to. I'm leaving because I have to. For you, for me, for everything we can't undo. You gave me something I didn't know I needed, truth. Connection. The feeling of being seen. I'll never forget you for that. But the more I stay, the more I risk hurting you. And I can't bear to be the reason you lose yourself. So I'm letting go, but that doesn't mean I'm forgetting. Please don't either." Tears blurred the words by the time I reached the end. I pressed the note to my chest and sat on the edge of his bed, letting the weight of his absence settle over me. Later that evening, I told Charles the first needed to visit my sister for a few days. He didn't ask many questions. He rarely did. As I drove out of the neighborhood, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Cole's car behind me. But there was only open road. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the ache in my chest twisting tighter with every mile. I wasn't sure where I was going, only that I needed time. To think, to breathe, to mourn something that had never really belonged to me. Because what we had wasn't just a mistake. It was real, too real. But love born from loneliness often burns too hot to last. And now, I had to live with the truth. We didn't end because it wasn't love. We ended because it was. In today's fast-paced world, emotional neglect often hides behind busy schedules and daily routines. This story reminds us how dangerous it can be to let emotional needs go unmet for too long. Love isn't just about presence, it's about connection. Being seen, heard, and valued. If you're feeling invisible in your relationship, don't wait for someone else to notice. Speak up, reflect, reconnect, and if that's no longer possible, have the courage to seek fulfillment in ways that honor your worth without compromising your values. Emotional honesty can be painful, but it's the first step toward healing and toward truly living.